Welcome to another episode of the Bakari Sellers Podcast. Many of you all know my father was one of the co-founders of a small fledgling civil rights organization called SNCC back in the day, and I am a child of the movement, so it's an honor to have one of the heroes of the movement on the show today, none other than the Reverend Al Sharpton. How you doing today, my brother?
I'm doing great, Bakari. Honored and glad to be with you. And your father was one of my heroes when I was growing up in the movement. And you cannot emphasize enough how much Cleveland Sellers was a role model for those of us that were younger guys. I started in SCLC in New York. I'm a Northerner. But we watched with him and Stokely and John Lewis and that generation did. Just like they watched Dr. King, who was like 10, 15 years older than them. They were like 10, 15 years older than me. So they were my role models.
You know, usually we start each episode by asking our guests to walk us through the arc of their career, but I feel like people generally know who you are, but maybe less likely or less familiar with your origin story. Talk to us about what events early in your life shaped your activism and your politics. And at what point did you realize that both the ministry and social justice would be your calling? And I got a follow-up question to that too.
All right, well, I started born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Father was a businessman, owned real estate, owned the corner store. He and my mother moved to Queens, New York when he started doing well. But when I was 10, he left us, abandoned us. So my mother had to move my sister and I back to Brooklyn. But this time we moved into the projects for a few months and then got a place in Brownsville. And my mother had to raise us from when I was 10 on welfare food stamps. I think that prompted my activism. I had already been a boy preacher. I started preaching the Church of God in Christ. First sermon, I was 4 years old. And preaching.
Oh, you were coaching?
I was coaching. I started.
Man, y'all stay in church all day long, Reverend Sharp.
All day long, all week long. And I started as a boy preacher, Washington Temple Church of God in Christ. By the time I was 7, I was doing the circuit. Time I was 9, I even did a couple of cities with gospel great Mahalia Jackson. So I was in the church where I had seen Dr. King and others who came to our church. So when we moved back to Brooklyn, but this time in the projects, I think that stirred my activism because I saw the difference in zip code. I was asking the kids my age in the neighborhood, why is all that garbage piled up? They said, oh, they pick up the garbage on Saturday. Well, where I lived in Queens, they picked it up twice a day. People call emergency room for an ambulance. It might take 12 hours in Brooklyn. So I started seeing the inequality. And about that time, because of my parents' separation, I spent a lot of time alone. I was a boy preacher, so a lot of the kids found it awkward praying with a guy that their parents were going to hear preach. So I started reading a lot of books, and I picked up a book by a guy named Claude Lewis about Adam Clayton Powell. And Adam Clayton Powell was a preacher, so that attracted me, but a politician and a civil rights activist. And as I read his book about Adam Clayton Powell, and got my mother convinced her to let me go to Harlem and try to see Adam Clayton Powell, which I did and got to be around him. That started me at a very young age in activism. And I started getting involved a lot in the campaign to keep Adam Clayton Powell in Congress. They were trying to expel him for some allegations. And my mother got concerned because she was a fundamentalist Church of God in Christ woman, wanted me to stay in the church. Why is he going to all of these rallies? He's only 11, 12 years old. She took me to our bishop, Bishop Washington. Bishop Washington said, I know what to do. And he took us to Reverend William Jones, who was the head of Dr. King's organization in New York. Dr. King was killed that year. I just turned 13 that October, before King was killed in April. And Reverend Jones says, I know what to do with him. I'll put him over our youth division of our chapter. And the Reverend Jones introduced me to Jesse Jackson. Jesse became my role model, and the rest was history. I grew up youth director of Breadbasket, on the former own youth group, on and on and on. So I never knew anything in life other than the ministry. and activism since I was a kid.
I mean, that's an impressive story. Talk a little bit about one of the more fascinating parts about your life's story, and something that most people don't know, but somebody who I actually think doesn't get enough credit for their civil rights activism, the greatest entertainer of all time, who actually put on the greatest concert of all time in Massachusetts after Dr. King was assassinated, helped keep the city from burning down. Talk about your relationship with none other than, we keep him in South Carolina. He was born in Beach Island. I know Augusta claims him, but he's from South Carolina. Talk about James Brown and your relationship with Mr. Brown.
James Brown had a son that was my age, Teddy Brown. And Teddy had come to New York, wanted to go to Columbia University Law School. And while he was in New York, a few months later, he joined my youth group. And we didn't really know that much about Teddy. Knew he was from the South. Unfortunately, Teddy, a few months in, got killed in a car accident. And James Brown, we found was his father. James Brown contacted the local disc jockeys in New York and said he wanted to do a memorial for Teddy. But he was having friction with some of the guys in Harlem because James Brown had went out with Floyd McKissick and them and endorsed Nixon in '72. This was 1973. I was 19 years old. And they said, well, there's this teenage preacher, as a youth group, your son was involved. If you do it for them, nobody's gonna bother you. Nobody's gonna picket them. We did a concert, James Brown started, sold it out. He liked me, he said, you remind me the same zeal as Teddy. And about 2 weeks later, he sent for me to come give him an award on Soul Train, which Soul Train those days like doing Meet the Press ×4. And we started staying in touch, and over a period of time, we had a father-son relationship. You know, a lot of writers that do write about it said I became like a road manager. I was never a road manager. I was just companion. Sometimes he sent me on the weekend. And I think in many ways, though he had a lot of other kids, I became a replacement for Teddy. And you talk about Beach Island, I spent many days at Beach Island in his estate, which was rare because James Brown didn't let people in his house. And you can count on both hands the people he led past that big gate, but he had 62 acres in Beach Island. And I rode with him up to places to see his aunt, who lived in Bamberg.
Bamberg, yep. And he put his mama over there in Bamberg. That was James used to come through Denmark on his way to Bamberg, and he rolled down the window of his limousine and hand out $100 bills.
That's right. I've gone through those rides with him. James Brown, I always say to guys around me and ladies around me that James Brown became the father that left me. He literally was like a father. He reprimanded me, tell me to do these things and all. Even though our politics was different. Jesse was my teacher. James Brown was my father.
I love that, man. I'm glad we were able to get to that. Let's talk a little bit about your new book, Righteous Troublemakers. You are that. Some of us are trying to be that, me and Ben Crump and many others who are out here trying to do that work. Why did you write this book? Who is your audience, and what do you want your readers to get from it?
Well, first of all, you and Ben Crump are certainly righteous troublemakers. Don't underestimate your impact and what you've done, among other things, but for the Charleston 9 family is amazing and historic. But let me say, I always was very sensitive that there were people that never got credit for what they did in the movement. You know this, and your father knows this. And in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, I preached the funeral of George Floyd. I worked with the family, worked with Ben, and I called just in the middle of the eulogy for a march on Washington. We had no plans, had not got a permit, didn't raise a dime, but we were able to put it together in 3 months. When we got to Washington that day, over 200,000 people came out in a pandemic. And I remember as I was going to the stage, the family of George Floyd was there, family of Breonna Taylor, everybody was there, all the families. And we're gonna stand there on the steps where Dr. King and the '63 march was, Martin Luther King III was with us. And coming through the crowd, a man, an older man, looked like he might have been in his 80s, was like jumping up and down with something in his hand. So I told the security detail around us, I said, wait a minute, see what that old man wants. He's trying to tell us something. And they brought him over and he showed me a button. He said, Reverend Al, I was here in '63 with Dr. King. There's a button that said March on Washington. I think Freedom Now was at the bottom of the button. He says, and I want to be here today with you. And I hugged him, thanked him, and they ushered us all up to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And I thought about that days later, and I said, nobody knows that man's name. Nobody knows his story. But he was there in '63 and back here in 2020. These are the people that made a movement, the foot soldiers, the ones that were at the back of the line, knew they weren't going to be on TV that night, knew their name wasn't going to be in the paper, but they made the movements. If they had not been there, they wouldn't have worked. And I said, we need to tell the stories of people that people never heard of. So I started doing research, and I asked my staff at National Action Network, I said, did you ever hear of Claudette Colvin? They said, no. I said, Claudette Colvin was a young, very young Black girl who sat in the front of the bus in Montgomery, refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, 9 months before Rosa Parks. They arrested her because she wouldn't give up her seat. The people in Montgomery, Black people, didn't want to use her as a symbol to fight because she was too dark-skinned.
Yep.
It was colorism at that time. And she was pregnant and not married. I wanted to write her story. I asked, do you know attorney Paulie Murray? Everybody, no, never heard of him. Paulie Murray was one of these legal minds that wrote a lot of legal work. That Thurgood Marshall used some of that in Brown versus the Board of Education. Right. So I wanted to write a book since I have these platforms now and have my share limelight. I wanted to put a limelight on some of the troublemakers that never got credit. In it is telling stories of movements that people never knew happened. And I think that it is incumbent on those of us that when we get a little light, put a light on some of these people. And I wanted people to read their stories. Why? Because I want people to know it was ordinary people.
That's right.
They have had things in their lives that we've had in ours, but that they, despite whatever mistakes they made, despite whatever their situation was, they were the ones that were the pillars of the movement. And I want to tell their story. Everybody should have in their house the stories of these people because these people paid the price and never got anything for it.
Look at you with your critical race theory out there, Reverend Sharpton, teaching people about this history. What lessons from this book and just from your life, what lessons from those unsung heroes do you think are instructive for activists now, especially as it looks like the momentum we saw post George Floyd is starting to wear off and that window of opportunity for policy change seems to be closing? What lessons do you want the activists of today to take from these unsung heroes?
I think the lessons, and I write a lot about it in the book about how these people were, is that movements are usually exactly what you just said. They go through peaks and valleys, ups and downs. And the real soldiers are the ones that are there when it's not trending. You know, we're in social media. And you never know what is going to catch on and what's not going to catch on. And you've got to be there for the long run, but you must have a goal that unless you're going to change laws or policies that will outlast the moment and will outlast even your relevance, then what are you in it for? You're not in it because you want to get likes on Facebook or Instagram. You're in it for laws, which is why we said in the middle of the momentum, we need the George Floyd Policing Act. We need to deal with Voting Rights Act. And we're still on it. You're right. A lot of the momentum is gone, but those of us that was in it are still pressing. Joe Biden just last week came out finally saying the filibuster shouldn't stand in the way of the Voting Rights Act. Behind that, we've got to go back into George Floyd Act. And I want people to learn movements are only successful if they make concrete change that outlasts the participants. Otherwise, it was a moment, but it wasn't a movement.
Hey man, let me ask you a little bit about that. I was going to get to those politics, but you must do TV, Reverend Sharpton. That was a natural segue.
A little bit.
Leader Schumer announced that the Senate would be considering changes to the filibuster on MLK weekend with the hopes of paving the way for voting rights legislation, which I think it's amazing to me. I was looking for some reason, because he just passed, I was researching Bob Dole. And in 1982-83, Bob Dole was the individual who led the effort to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. And we can't even get 10 Republicans today to sign on to it. But like everything else, Manchin and Sinema have said that they don't support changes to the rules for a carve out to the filibuster for voting rights. What do you think? You've seen this politics, you've seen the ebb and flows. What do you think ultimately happens here?
I think ultimately we need what is beginning to happen now. Schumer to call the vote, the president to come out strong, and he has to keep coming out strong, and force Manchin and Sinema to, on the record, go against their whole caucus. And one of two things will happen. Either they will say, well, let's find another way around, because they've done carve-outs for judicial nominees. They've done carve-outs for any of the budgetary concerns. What is more fundamental than a carve-out around the filibuster for the right to vote to be protected? That's the basis of the American experiment. I think that pressure must stay on from people emailing their senators, writing, but those of us that are in those rooms to keep the pressure on and force the vote. And I think the vote in and of itself will put pressure on Manchin and them. Already in our meetings and conversations with Manchin, he's beginning to say, well, let's try to do something in these ways. Now, you got to remember, he said, well, they won't vote for this bill. Let me draft a bill. And he passed a bill of freedom to vote. He couldn't get one Republican to go with his bill. So you're right. Not only can't we get 10 Republicans to make the filibuster, he can't get one on his freedom to vote bill. We need to keep this going because there's a showdown. And I think finally with Schumer calling the vote and the president coming out, we have an opportunity at worst to make a roll call, at best to push those two Democrats and get a rule change. The whole defense of saying, well, the Democrats, Sinema and them saying, well, if we do it, the Republicans will do it when they're in power. If the Republicans get back in power, they're going to do it anyway.
You know they are.
I don't think anybody in their right mind think Mitch McConnell would say, oh, well, y'all didn't do it, so I'm not going to do it. He will do it. He did it for Trump, and he will do it again. We need to do it for the people to have protection of the right to vote.
I mean, he did it for 3 Supreme Court justices, so let's not act like he ain't gonna do it again. You know, my brother Charlemagne, the guy, got a lot of pushback for asking the vice president about Joe Manchin. But there are a lot of people listening. I mean, I know you're in the room with him, and he will take your call. Well, he might have used to take your calls. I guess he might still take them every now and then. But what can the average person do to help the president and the National Action Network in their push to get Joe Manchin and Sinema to do things like pass voting rights or pass Build Back Better? What can we do out here in these streets to make that happen?
I think we need to continue rallying, but everybody may not rally. Everybody has 2 U.S. senators from their state. They should be emailing and or calling their senator's office, because it's no loss when a senator's secretarial staff is saying, we got 100 calls a day on voting rights from people that live in our state that say they're watching voting. They want you to talk to Senator. They want you to talk to Manchin. Everybody can do that. You can do that sitting in the cubicle at work. You can do it at home. Everybody, just your 2 senators. Because if they keep talking about them being overwhelmed in their offices by their own constituents, it makes them push, because then they're afraid of the voting backlash that they will suffer.
You know, talking about our home senators, I think that I was a little naive, and sometimes that happens at 37, because I actually had faith in my good friend Tim Scott, who served with me in the State House, that we were going to pass George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I thought that was something he honestly wanted to get done, but it just fell apart. So let's say we don't get criminal justice reform done. What do you think we need to see from the Biden administration and Department of Justice to compel the type of reforms and oversight we need from local police departments and sheriff's offices?
I think that we need to push for the laws, and if we cannot get them, then we need to ask and put the real strength we have on the president to issue executive orders as far as he can. There's some things he can do with executive orders. Now, we've not asked for that publicly yet, because we don't want to let the Senate off the hook on George Floyd bill. But when it appears, and that's coming sooner than later, that we cannot get that through, we will be saying to Joe Biden and Dave, let's do something with executive orders. There must be something there Monday and coming I'm going to Los Angeles to preach the funeral of that young 14-year-old Latina that was killed by a bullet that went through the dressing room door. I mean, the cases that you and Ben Crump and Lee Merritt and others have had the case. I mean, y'all can't handle enough cases. And the thing that bothers me more than anything is it's become normalized to where people are like numb. And we've got to tell people, you could be the next victim. This is not something that happened. Walter Scott wasn't an activist. They didn't shoot him because he was a troublemaker in town. The same with George Floyd. These are ordinary people. That's your cousin. That's your nephew. And if you don't help us stop this, you will be one calling Bakari Sellers to come represent you soon.
And listen, I talk to Ben about it all the time, and we were sitting in the back of the car where you preached the eulogy. We were headed over to the funeral of Andrew Brown in Elizabeth City. And right. we were both thinking that if we did not have this part of our practice, we would be quite happy. You know, if we didn't have to represent these families, that this was not something that came to our doorstep, because these families never anticipate that they would be a part of this fraternity. Look, a couple more questions before I let you go. I know you're busy. Talk to me about, I always ask authors this question because I felt this way when I was writing my book, but how did writing this book change you?
I think the way it changed me is it made me go back into scenes, because I talk a lot in there about some of the things. I talk about some of what we went through with George Floyd and some of the heroes in that case that people didn't know. And it puts you back in the scene where you start reflecting and thinking about, wow, what did this really mean? Why did you say this? Why did this person say that? I think sometimes we operate so quickly in the moment that we never step back out of the moment and look at it. And it made me more sensitive to what we do and how it impacts people. I remember we were getting ready to get in the cars to go to George Floyd's funeral, and I write about this in the book. And George's son walked over to me in the lobby of the hotel. We were getting ready to get in the cars, and he said, you know, my little sister said my father's gonna change the world. I said, yeah, I think he will. There are people marching all over the world. And he said, and that was President Obama just got off the phone with us. My father really changed the world. And for the first time writing about it, I thought about this kid on one day looking at his father, and his father moved to a different state now. And the next day his father's this symbol. What did this mean to this kid? And how many other kids are like that around the country? I think writing the book was sort of therapeutic for me to begin to construct these things and deal with the fact that we're talking about human beings who are thrust into things that you and I are used to every day, but they're not. And that we've gotten a real debt to their lives to help change those lives.
When will the book be available, and how can people buy it?
Book will be in every bookstore on Monday coming, Monday the 10th of January, and they can pre-order going to www.alsharptonbooks.com. From there, you can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you buy your books and pre-order it and get it now.
I love that. My last question for you before I let you go, I want to talk a little bit about your longtime friend and the new mayor of New York City, Eric Adams. You know him well. It seems like folks don't know what to make of the mayor. Why do you think he is such an interesting guy or figure for people who write and follow the New York City politics, and what can New Yorkers expect from him as mayor of the city?
Well, Eric Adams, 35 years ago, became a police officer. He was involved in the movement under activists in New York, Reverend Herbert Daughtry, who encouraged young Black guys go in the force and change from the inside. I, coming in the King movement in New York, as I told you growing up, you got to remember in New York was not the South, and New York was more of Malcolm's town than Martin's town.
Yeah,
so it wasn't popular what I was doing. And it wasn't popular when he became a cop, because many of the activists were saying, don't join the police, fight the police. So he and I kind of backed into each other because we had the common isolation of some of the activist communities. So we knew each other well. I started National Action Network in '91. I'd known him 5 or 6 years. He'd come to some of the rallies I had done around Bensonhurst and the Central Park 5. Even as a cop, he was fighting for reform. So when I started National Action Network, I started the Saturday rallies in Harlem. He came, and our lawyer, Attorney Michael Hardy, said, you know, we're going to have to incorporate if we're going to raise money and open offices, hire staff, and we need to get several people that'll sign and be incorporated. Eric Adams was one of the incorporators of the network. Now, he always had his own way. He has his own kind of way of thinking. He is an activist, but he's also very practical. There will probably be some disagreements on some of the fine print with some of the so-called progressives, but I know that he is certainly as hard as right, and he's not afraid, he's not intimidated. You can't walk the beat New York 24 years and be intimidated. I think you're gonna get an honest mayor, a straight mayor, and a guy that wants to see things done. He's 61 years old, he's not a kid. He wants to build a legacy that he turned New York for the better and turned it around. And I think that's what you're gonna see. The reason why a lot of people in the media are perplexed is you never had a guy that was both a police reformer and a policeman, a black guy, but was comfortable with everybody. He is the makeup of something they've never seen, which means he can get things done that has not been done.
Amen to that. Reverend Sharpton, thank you for being the hero that you are. I'm from South Carolina. We always say that you got to give people their flowers while they're living. So we say thank you for everything that you have done, everything you will do, my brother. And thank you for joining the show today.
Thank you, Bakari. And you know you're one of my favorites. And it helps me. I'm 67, 30 years older than you. It helps me to know that the movement will continue no matter how long I last.
That's right. Amen. Be easy, man. Have a great day.
All right. Peace. All right.